Oh, I better turn my thing on.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now, the purpose of this interview is for the magazine, or is it a dual purpose? Does it have a dual purpose? It's for the magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Ready? We can start in 3, 2, 1.
In 2015, I wrote a short story called Magic. Today I have the pleasure to be with the person whom I have transferred the right to write the screenplay for that short story. My good friend Don Boy. How are you?
Hi. Good to meet you. Hi.
Your filmmaking career began in the 1970s. Tell us about these first years in the industry and how did they influence the years to come?
That's a very good and interesting question, actually. I was lucky in the sense that I went to film school in 1968 to 1970, at a time when the film industry in Britain had had a big downturn. But for that reason, all the great directors from the Ealing comedy era in British cinema were teachers. And so I was taught by some of the men who'd made some of the great films of the 1950s, The Lavender Hill Mob, The Man in the White Suit, and these guys, Charlie Crichton, Alexander McKendrick, were people that taught me about cinema. And when I left film school, I was pretty lucky. I got a job doing a documentary film about an overland trip from London to Delhi. And that got me a job at the BBC. When I made that film, the BBC took me on. And in those days, going to the BBC was a bit like going to university. I was very young, by the way. I got a scholarship to film school when I was barely 20. And at the BBC, I learned my craft, if you like. Directed a whole bunch of commercials. And when I left the commercial scene, which included, by the way, a Coca-Cola commercial starring Kipchoge Keino, the great Kenyan athlete, who won many gold medals. When I was making that commercial, I thought, I've got to make movies. And I made a lot of money making commercials. And when I sort of stopped it, it was at the lowest ebb the British cinema has known for a very long time. When I was shooting another film for Chrysler at Pinewood Studios, I was the only film on the lot, on the studio lot at the time. It was a very depressed time, very little funding for films. You didn't have video, you didn't have the internet, of course. Very few films that were made were shown on television. And so there was this extraordinary opportunity, in a strange way, for somebody who was passionate about cinema and came from a very creative institution, the London Film School. It came at a time when I felt it was a bit like the Wild West. You could go out and do almost anything. It was like going and prospecting for gold when everybody else was trying to do the same thing. In fact, but at the same time, Hollywood had abandoned British cinema. The big studios like MGM all decided they didn't want to have studios based in Britain at the time. And so I, in a very cavalier way, said, well, okay, I've got some money. I'm going to stick this into films that, first of all, I directed, and secondly, I decided I wanted to make a series of films with interesting artists, interesting directors, interesting writers that were interested in making cinema, but completely independently. So we didn't seek partnerships with the studios. We couldn't, they just weren't interested. And the other thing that was a factor in that stage is that the cost of a film was such that you could go out and make an independent film for under £200,000 and it wouldn't look any different to one that had cost £5 million if you were ingenious and canny. And so I had a little studio of my own at that time, and we were the only studio in Europe of that kind. And that gives you a sort of, not a monopoly, but it gives you a certain status. And so it was a very exciting time. And So although the industry was depressed in the 70s, I was riding high. It was an extraordinary time for my life, and I was barely 30. Ironically, that led to producing a film in Hollywood, which cost $24 million, almost within 2 years of my successes in Britain. So it was a very interesting period for me.
You have worked with the likes of John Hurt and Richard Harris, as well as Robert Altman and Jean-Luc Godard. How was the experience working with such renowned legends of the silver screen?
Rather like Ian Fleming, the great writer of James Bond books, I always took the view that there were only two people that were phenomenally important to revere, two men to revere. One was Winston Churchill, and the other was God. And so when I worked with these people that I regarded as really great artists, I approached them on an equal basis. I didn't, and this was not arrogance, it was just that I felt comfortable, I'd had an element of success, and I worked with them very much collaboratively. And that was the weird thing, that these people, particularly Richard and Godard, had reputations for being impossible to work with. Very difficult, very, very feisty, very opinionated. And in both cases, sure, they were like that. But in Godard's case, from the beginning, we had a very friendly, poetic relationship. Richard was up and down. We adored each other, but we fought like mad during the period of doing that. But I've learned that you've got to be very straight. You've got to say, no, that doesn't work. And if they say, well, we want to do it like that, and I say, well, have a go. And then they do it, and then they realise they're wrong, and then they come back to my view. It's a very interesting equation between people who've had great success, who are brilliant, between their desire to make sure they do well and have somebody that isn't going to second guess the whole time, to a situation where you have some sort of control over their work.
Your film journey is incredibly diverse. You have been director, producer, and writer. Which of these areas is closer to the heart for Don Boy?
I have to say, in my passport, I call myself a film director, and that's really what, when I was at film school, I learned to do. Having said that, I really love writing. I've taken the view before, and this is maybe why it was so good to have your short story as inspiration for the film that I've just written for you, that when I write, it's good to have another person who is a writer, whereas I'm a director, to be a balance to the work. I have found that when I've collaborated with writers, some of the best work has come out of it. Writers who are very talented, they come off left field, they come up with ideas that you wouldn't have dreamt of. I've now learnt that actually I've got to have my brain tuned in that way myself as a writer. But it's quite a lonely process, writing. My wife is a best-selling novelist, and she shuts herself up in the cubbyhole upstairs and gets on with it, and is pretty lonely at times, and is focused constantly on her work. As a director, it's exciting because you're dealing with a huge crew. You're dealing with some very, very clever artists in their own right, cinematographers, production designers, and I love that interaction with them, and I love bringing out their talents to match my own vision of what I'm trying to do. And I have to say that's the thing about directing films. There are two kinds of films though that I've made. I've made movies with huge crews. The Hollywood film we had, I was the boss of 10,000 people whose paychecks were being paid for at some stage over the period of time. That's a lot of people. But generally on a movie that's an independent movie, there might be 200 or 300 people. On the set, there'll only be maybe 70 or 80, or even less than that. But that's quite a handling situation. Documentary films, you've got a director. Sometimes the director is also the cameraman, a sound recordist, and that's about it. And there's something very pure and very exciting about that. And I've enjoyed making documentary films hugely. The process that is a little lonely in both cases is the editing process. Because when you finish shooting, you're sitting there on your own with all the material you've shot, thinking, oh, I wish I'd shot that better than that, or that's rubbish, that's terrible. And you then almost construct the film again, especially in the documentary field. The documentary field, the editing process is almost like writing, and it's quite lonely. In a movie where you're shooting with 150, 200 people, suddenly there's just you and the editor. It's quite a sobering moment.
You have experienced much of the world, and your life and career have allowed you to spend some time on the African continent. Do you feel that Africa has evolved particularly within the film industry?
I was asked earlier on, whether I was Scottish, which I was. I was born in Scotland. My mother actually was half Russian, half Ukrainian. But I actually believe, in a strange way, mysterious way, that I'm an African, because I've spent a large proportion of my life, almost more so in Africa than anywhere else. I was brought up partially in Uganda and in Kenya, and I've revisited Africa many times. I'm parallel to Magic, making a film in Morocco, which we've written. I've been to South Africa twice to make films, once for Channel 4, once for the BBC, and I love Africa passionately. I made a film quite recently about the African Film Festival that takes place in Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. And I can't tell you how much fun I had doing that, and it was intriguing. And there you saw a plethora of African cultures, and I felt I identified with all of them, I understood them, despite the very broad range of cultures that they represented. If you think about Algeria or Morocco, when you compare their culture to, say, Tanzania, where I've also filmed, they're very, very different. Tanzania has 120 different languages, for instance. That's fascinating. And here in South Africa, of course, you've got a very exciting new, vibrant economy, society. I feel it as soon as I come here. I looked around at the airport today and thought, wow, this is the Africa that I feel familiar with. Very different to Nigeria.
You are an honorary professor at the University of Exeter in the College of Humanities, a governor of the London Film School for 30 years, an artistic director for Highbrow.tv, an online platform for arts. How does academia nurture the mind and soul of Don, the filmmaker?
Actually, I feel a bit of a fake academic. I don't really see myself as an academic. But what I've discovered is that I have the ability to pass on what I'm excited about personally and what I've learnt. And so in that sense, I enjoy being in academic environments. One of the things I did at the London Film School was I did this voluntarily. I wasn't paid for this, although the university obviously pays me. But when I was at the film school, they have an MA course in screenwriting. And one of the key things about screenwriting is that, of course, it's not an end, what you produce is not the finished article. You're screenwriting for it to be made into a film. And one of the things they weren't doing was engaging the students with a director character. So I very perversely spent a year going through 16 MA students' work as screenwriters and reading their scripts and then inputting on the scripts the directorial input, so that they would understand that when they left with their polished script, there would be somebody else saying, hold on a minute, we don't like that sequence, we don't like that character. Why did they say that? Why isn't this section of the film working whereas the earliest section was? And that, by the way, and this is something that's very, very idiosyncratic perhaps, but it's very sobering because it teaches me as much as it teaches them. And so in that sense, I love my academic work for that reason. You have to think philosophies out. You have to think technologies out to pass on your own information. I spend almost more time preparing a lecture for the university than I do writing your script.
And finally, please share with our readers and viewers what brings you back to the Southern Hemisphere, having previously been in South Africa directing the documentary Man Gat Africa.
I've been in Africa since, as Man Got in Africa, as I said, in Burkina Faso and in Morocco. But that's a great question and an easy one to answer. I have a friend who was the manager of Wham, and was a very important manager of people in the music industry. In a metaphorical way, the problems that South Africa was going through in 1975-76. A small fact that I discovered is that television didn't happen in South Africa until January of 1976 for a start. But magic also had a very important aspect of magic had intrigued me from the day that I'd seen a gully man on board a ship in Port Said when I was about 7, because my father wouldn't fly from anywhere, he had to go by boat. So we would come down sometimes on the garden route, but then we would go through the Suez Canal when that was possible, and the ship would stop in Port Said, and onto the ship would come with this man who did the most brilliant magic tricks. I'd never forgotten them, and they were sort of iconic in my mind as far as that's concerned. And this short story was beautifully written and had a tragic element to it as well. Had funny elements to it, but predominantly it was this opportunity to deal with an era that, thank heavens, has gone, but to explain that characters and individuals within that era were strong and had an opportunity to survive. And of course, the story had this extraordinary ingredient that I was so attracted to, which is the ingredient of magic. And of course, magic has such a place in African society too. Man God in Africa demonstrates the Africans' spiritualist tendencies, blended with Pentecostal Christianity, which fascinated me. And so when I read the short story, I said to Simon, I'm your man. Maybe he'll find me in 10 days' time.
Great. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Don, for this magical moment, and we hope to hear more about this.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. That was awesome. Just a quick